Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her in front of the nursing station, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for those he considered beneath his credentials. Katie Morrison didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply continued adjusting the 4-bag for the 7-year-old in bed 7, her movements precise and unhurried, while Sterling's words hung in the fluorescent-lit air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Nobody knew that those hands had once steadied themselves under mortar fire in Sanjan Valley. Nobody knew that those hands had kept 37 Navy SEALs alive through a 72-hour siege in Helmand Province. Katie Morrison was just a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston, running on 4 hours of sleep and the kind of quiet composure that made people forget she was in the room at all. The pediatric ICU hummed with the mechanical rhythm of ventilators and cardiac monitors, a soundtrack of fragile heartbeats that only the trained ear could parse into meaning. She'd clocked in at 05:05 before the sunrise painted the hospital corridors in shades of orange that felt obscene against the fluorescent white of the patient rooms. Her locker still held her most prized possession, a pair of worn combat boots, the leather creased and weathered in ways that told stories nobody here would ever understand. The call sign stitched inside the right boot, Reaper, belonged to a life she'd left behind, a woman in body armor and face paint who no longer existed in polished hallways that smelled of antiseptic and broken promises. The boy in bed 7 hadn't spoken in 6 months. His name was Marcus, age 7, admitted 3 weeks ago with his father, Lieutenant Commander James Reeves, standing guard in the chair beside him like a man who'd learned the hard way that nothing could be protected without constant surveillance. The chart's psychiatric notes were accumulating like snowfall. Patient exhibit selective mutism. Trauma response to witnessed combat incident. Refuses speech therapy. Psychiatric consult pending. The father's military insurance codes gleamed in the digital file, and Katie had learned to recognize the patterns of how money moved through institutions. She'd seen enough of it in the field hospitals of Jalabad and Kandahar, the way authority flowed toward those who controlled the billing, the way resources followed the dollars rather than the need. Katie approached bed 7 at 06:05, her timing deliberate, her movements economical. The boy's eyes tracked her progress without his head turning, a small victory in the long war of his silence. She didn't speak to him. She'd learned that lesson from the speech therapist who'd left his room in frustration 3 days ago, but she let her presence settle into the space like a familiar weight. She checked the 4-line running into his left arm, her fingers steady as she verified the flow rate and inspected the insertion site for any sign of infiltration. The bag above the bed was half empty, saline running clear, feeding his system what it needed to survive. She made a note in the electronic chart, for patent, no complications, recommend continued current infusion protocol, single nurse continuity of care to minimize patient anxiety. That last notation would matter later. It would matter more than she could have imagined. The boy's father had stepped out 10 minutes earlier, moving with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd learned to function while broken. Katie had recognized the signs, the way his shoulders curved inward as though trying to protect something that couldn't be protected, the way his eyes never fully focused on anything in the present moment. She'd seen that exact expression in Helmand Province, wearing different faces, all of them marked by the same kind of weight. She'd known him as commander then, had coordinated with his unit during the siege, had spent 96 hours sleeping for minutes at a time while processing casualty reports and triaging the wounded. But he'd never seen her face without combat paint. He wouldn't recognize the woman in pale blue scrubs and ID badge number for 7821. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound that would have driven her mad 3 years ago but now barely registered. She'd learned to filter out the ambient noise of hospitals, to isolate the sounds that mattered, the subtle change in a monitor's rhythm, the almost inaudible hiss of an air leak in an oxygen line, the soft click of a syringe being loaded into an 4-port. Her ears had been trained by the rotor wash of Black Hawks and the percussion of mortar rounds echoing off canyon walls. A hospital's noise was, by comparison, almost peaceful. Dr. Sterling arrived at 06:05, his footsteps announcing his presence before his voice did. He was a man who'd learned early that sound could be weaponized, that volume could masquerade as confidence. His watch, a Rolex, Katie noted, the kind that cost more than 6 months of her salary, caught the harsh fluorescent light as he flipped through patient charts. He was checking the psychiatric consultation codes, his eyes lingering on the insurance billing with the intensity of a man studying a menu at his favorite restaurant. Ms. Morrison. There was no question mark at the end of her name. It was a statement of address that carried implicit criticism. Katie turned from the four-stand, her expression neutral, her hand still. She'd learned long ago that the smallest movement could be interpreted as defensiveness, as sass, as insubordination. Dr. Sterling. I need to discuss your notes from this morning. He held the chart at his side, his voice carrying that particular timbre reserved for addressing staff he considered beneath him. Katie had heard variations of that tone in hospital break rooms and officers' clubs and military forward operating bases. It was the voice of institutional power, and it assumed obedience as a baseline condition. The 4 protocol or the care continuity recommendation. Katie's voice was steady, her tone professional. She was deferential without being submissive, a distinction most people couldn't perceive but which kept her breathing. Your recommendation for single nurse continuity of care. Sterling's jaw tightened. He didn't like being asked clarifying questions. He preferred statements that required no response. It's not standard protocol. Nursing rotation prevents burnout. The patient shows elevated anxiety during care transitions. Katie's hands remained at her sides. She was good at this, at standing still while being examined, at accepting critique without absorbing it. I observed 3 separate incidents of increased heart rate and agitation during shift changes over the past week. You're not a psychiatrist, Ms. Morrison. The words landed the way they were intended to land. Katie watched Sterling's face, the way his eyes flickered with satisfaction at her non-reaction. He'd anticipated trembling, expected the defensive posture of someone caught overstepping their role. The fact that she simply stood there, absorbing the criticism like a dam absorbs rainfall, seemed to irritate him further. No, sir. But I've been monitoring the cardiac response data. Sterling turned his attention back to the chart, which meant the conversation was entering its terminal phase. He would make his decision now, would assert his authority in whatever form it took. Katie waited, her breathing measured, her posture relaxed enough to appear unthreatening while remaining alert enough to react to whatever came next. Your observation is noted. Sterling's voice had shifted into that particular register that preceded institutional consequences. He pulled a pen from his pocket, a Mont Blanc, Katie noticed, another piece of equipment designed to communicate status, and began scrawling notes across the chart with aggressive precision. However, your recommendation appears to exceed the scope of a bedside nurse. I'm documenting your insubordination and your overstepping of established protocols. The words were formal, the kind designed to read well in a disciplinary file that would appear in her personnel record and potentially in testimony if this ever became litigious. Katie had learned to recognize the vocabulary of institutional protection, the language that transformed criticism into documentation, observations into liability. Understood, Doctor. She didn't say it was unjust. She didn't argue the merits of her observation. She simply accepted the consequence with the kind of quiet dignity that seemed to enrage him even further. Sterling finished scrawling his note and turned toward the nurse's station, already pivoting his attention toward the next assertion of control, the next opportunity to establish his position in the hospital's hierarchy. Katie returned to her patient care documentation, her fingers moving across the electronic keyboard with practiced efficiency. In the background, she could hear the distant cascade of a medical emergency somewhere in the building, the muffled pages, the accelerated footsteps of personnel responding to codes that would consume the next hours. She didn't react. She simply completed her notes and checked the clock, 0650. Shift change in approximately 4 hours. The break room existed as a kind of neutral zone, a space where nurses theoretically existed outside the hierarchy of patient care. In practice, it was a microcosm of institutional power dynamics, where alliances formed based on who was perceived to be ascending or descending through the professional ranks. Katie had learned to treat it as a refueling station. She entered, retrieved coffee or a protein bar from the refrigerator, and departed without lingering. The social structure was simple and efficient, those aligned with Sterling, those neutral, and those who'd somehow ended up on his opposing side. She'd somehow ended up on his opposing side. At 10:40, Katie opened the break room door to find 3 nurses, Rodriguez, Chen, and Thompson, gathered around a small table in the far corner. The conversation stopped the moment she entered. Not gradually, not with the natural conclusion of a topic, but with the sudden silence of participants recognizing the arrival of someone excluded from their circle. Katie could have pretended not to notice, could have simply retrieved her lunch from the refrigerator and exited. Instead, she sat at the opposite end of the room, opened her meal container, and stared at the pasta without actually seeing it. The 3 nurses resumed their conversation with deliberate casualness, their voices just loud enough to be heard by someone in the room. They were discussing the weekend, making plans, discussing a television show none of them seemed to have actually watched. Their words were designed less for each other and more for Katie's benefit, a demonstration that she existed in the room while remaining fundamentally outside their sphere of social inclusion. Katie ate approximately 4 forkfuls of the pasta before setting it aside. Her hands were steady. She didn't look in their direction, didn't acknowledge their conversation, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing that their exclusion had registered emotionally. She simply sat, composed and present, while being systematically ignored in a room where 3 other people could barely tolerate breathing the same air. After approximately 8 minutes, the 3 nurses gathered their things and left the break room without acknowledging her departure. The door closed behind them with a soft hydraulic hiss. Katie remained in the break room for another 3 minutes, staring at the wall. Then she stood, retrieved her meal, and moved toward her locker. She needed the boots today. She needed to remember who she used to be, before the institution, before the silence, before she'd learned to accept critique without flinching. The locker door opened with a metallic click. The boots sat there in the corner, worn leather shaped by the particular geology of combat operations in Helmand Province. The call sign Reaper was stitched into the right boot in thread that had faded to near invisibility. She reached down and touched the leather without taking them out, letting her fingers trace the scars and creases that documented 100 kilometers of patrol, of operations, of moments where the difference between success and failure had measured itself in individual heartbeats. Katie withdrew her hand and closed the locker door. She would not wear the boots. She would not announce her hidden identity through something as obvious as military footwear. She would simply remember that they existed, that somewhere beneath the scrubs and the professional demeanor and the institutional hierarchy, there existed a woman who'd been trained to survive things that would destroy most people. A woman who'd learned to survive things like Dr. Sterling. The rest of the shift proceeded with mechanical precision. Katie completed her charting at 11:55. She verified the afternoon nurse's understanding of the patient protocol at 1200. She spent 30 minutes with the boy in bed 7, not speaking, simply sitting in the chair beside him while the monitors documented his vital signs in steady, predictable rhythm. His small hand emerged from beneath the blanket at 12:30 and rested on her sleeve. She didn't acknowledge it directly. She'd learned that direct acknowledgement could sometimes break the fragile bridges that wounded children built toward the people they allowed close. She simply let her hand rest near his, steady and available, a presence that required nothing from him except that he exist in the same room while she existed in the same room. At 12:45, a Marine corpsman, a young kid, maybe 22, passed in the hallway carrying supplies to the supply closet. He did a double take. His eyes locked onto Katie's face for approximately 3 seconds, and she watched the recognition begin to crystallize, the moment where a neural pathway started connecting the impossible math of a woman in scrubs to a call sign he'd heard in briefings. Katie shook her head once, very deliberately, and looked away. The corpsman hesitated. Then he continued walking toward the supply closet, his footsteps measured and careful, carrying with him the recognition he would tell no one. That was one person. There would be others eventually. There always were. Katie checked the clock at 1300, still another 4 hours until shift change. She had survived worse things than institutional exclusion and professional humiliation. She had survived IED blasts and firefights and the particular nightmare of triage decisions that meant someone had to be left behind. She would survive Dr. Sterling, survive the disciplinary write-up, survive the moment when her hidden identity would eventually surface and force the institution to acknowledge who it had been dismissing in the break room. Until then, she would simply continue doing the work. One patient at a time. One shift at a time. One quiet act of mercy at a time, in the dark corners of a hospital where heroes walked among them, sometimes in scrubs, sometimes pushing for stands, sometimes simply holding the hand of a silent child while the monitors documented the steady rhythm of a life learning how to live again. The nurses' station at Oak Creek Memorial hummed with the usual morning chaos, printers spitting discharge papers, phones ringing in overlapping frequencies, the soft beep of medication dispensers. Katie Morrison stood charting at the main desk, her movements economical and practiced, when Dr. Sterling's shadow fell across her keyboard at 0800. Morrison. When exactly did you complete your psychiatric residency? His voice carried the particular loudness of a man who wanted an audience. Heads turned. The unit secretary froze mid-keystroke. Katie didn't flinch. She took one measured breath, the kind that came from 6 years of combat medicine, from holding pressure on wounds while rounds whistled overhead, and turned to face him. The child needs consistency, doctor. Rotating staff every shift disrupts attachment and consistency. Sterling's laugh was a blade. Sharp. Deliberate. Performed. From nurse night shift. He turned toward bed 7, where Lieutenant Commander James Reeves stood holding his son's hand. The boy's eyes were fixed on nothing, his small fingers wrapped around his father's palm like a lifeline. Reeves's jaw tightened. He'd heard the nickname. He was hearing it now, delivered with the theatrical cruelty of a man who'd perfected the art of public humiliation. Commander, I apologize that our less experienced staff don't understand complex trauma cases. Sterling's tone shifted, honeyed, apologetic, the voice of a man speaking to a peer rather than someone who'd just been corrected by a nurse. Your son requires specialized psychiatric intervention. I've arranged consultations with Dr. Brookman's practice. Excellent credentials. He specializes in pediatric PTSD from military family systems. Katie stood still. Her hands remained at her sides. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their low, constant hum, a sound like insects trapped in the ceiling, pressing against the panels with invisible wings. Sterling moved to the unit board and uncapped a red marker with deliberate slowness. The sound it made, that plastic snap of the cap releasing, seemed to echo across the entire floor. He wrote in aggressive block letters, Morrison, written warning, insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of witnesses. Of people processing what they just watched. Of a professional reputation being dismantled in real time. Katie's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. Then her face settled back into its familiar neutral expression. But a single tear escaped, just one, which she wiped away with the back of her hand before it could reach her cheek. The gesture was so swift, so controlled, that someone watching might have thought she'd simply brushed something away. Dust. A stray hair. Nothing that mattered. I've seen trauma before, doctor. Her voice was flat. Conversational. It would have been a terrifying tone to anyone who understood what it meant. 7 years in hostile environments. The pattern recognition is consistent across. In your 18 months of pediatric nursing. Sterling cut her off, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. Please, Morrison. Don't confuse field experience with actual medical training. He turned away before she could respond, moving toward the station with the satisfied gait of a man who'd won a battle he'd designed specifically to win. Katie returned to her charting, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same steady rhythm as before. The team around her gradually returned to their tasks, phones answered, charts reviewed, the machinery of the hospital grinding forward. But something had shifted. Something invisible and total. At 1200, Katie entered the break room carrying her lunch in a reusable container, grilled chicken, brown rice, spinach. Fuel. Nothing more. 3 nurses were at the scarred table near the microwave, Jennifer from the day shift, Marcus from respiratory, and the unit secretary whose name Katie had never been given the chance to learn. They'd been talking. The conversation stopped the moment she sat down. Jennifer and Marcus exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that said everything. Then, wordlessly, they began gathering their food. Marcus pushed back his chair, the scrape of plastic against linoleum sharp and deliberate. Jennifer picked up her phone. The secretary tucked her yogurt container under her arm. None of them looked at Katie. They left her alone at the table with her untouched lunch and the knowledge that ostracism wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was a room emptying itself in real time. It was the absence of acknowledgement being a presence all its own. Katie opened the container. The chicken had cooled. She ate it anyway, methodical and unhurried, as though she were alone by choice rather than by exile. As though her colleagues leaving the moment she sat down was simply the natural order of a hospital shift. As though being invisible was not a new skill she'd acquired but an old one she'd buried 7 years ago. At 14:30, Katie was standing outside bed 7, reviewing the patient's medication schedule for the evening shift, when Sterling appeared beside her. His presence announced itself not by sound but by pressure. The air around him seemed to compress, the way it does before a thunderstorm. "Morrison, I'm reassigning this patient to the rotation schedule." It wasn't a discussion. It was a decree. You will not be his primary nurse. Moving forward, he'll be covered by the standard floor rotation. Patient safety protocol. Inside the room, Katie could see Lieutenant Commander Reeves's shoulders stiffen. He'd heard. Of course he'd heard. The words were meant to be heard. Katie's mouth opened. She wanted to say something, that continuity of care was evidence-based, that trauma-affected children needed consistency, that rotating staff would set this boy back weeks, maybe months. She wanted to say that she'd held hands in field hospitals while men bled out, that she understood trauma response at a level that had nothing to do with textbooks, that removing her was a mistake that would cost this child. She closed her mouth. "Understood," she said quietly. As she turned to walk away, Sterling was already on his phone, his voice low and efficient. "Mark, it's time to run that audit on Morrison's charts." "Yes, the whole 18 months. I need documentation by Friday. Financial discrepancies, medication administration patterns, anything that doesn't align with protocol." He paused, listening. "Exactly. Better to have it now, before she becomes a liability." Katie didn't stop walking. Her pace remained steady. Her breathing remained controlled. But her hands were quiet in a way that only come from training. Quiet in the way of someone whose hands had learned to be weapons and had learned to be healers and had learned, most crucially, to be both at the same time. Inside bed 7, the boy watched Katie pass the window. His small mouth opened slightly, his lips forming a shape that might have been a word. Might have been a name. Might have been the sound of someone trying to speak from inside a prison of silence, reaching for the one person who'd treated him like a human being rather than a symptom to be managed and rotated and documented. But Katie didn't turn back. That was the protocol now. That was the game that Dr. Sterling had redesigned, and Katie Morrison, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Combat Medic, woman who'd held 17 lives together in a Helmand Province field hospital while mortars fell like rain, had accepted the rules he'd written. She returned to the nurses' station and charted the reassignment into the system with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. One keystroke at a time. One clinical decision at a time. One small erasure of her own presence, documented in the hospital's permanent record. What she didn't know was that Sterling had already made 3 phone calls before 0800. What she didn't know was that the audit he was ordering would find nothing, because there was nothing to find, but that wouldn't matter. What she didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Reeves had looked at her for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary, and that something in that look had registered, had caught, had snagged on a memory that wouldn't quite surface. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting in the darkness of the pediatric ICU. The worst part was the monitors that would start screaming at 0300. The worst part was that Katie Morrison had one decision to make, one moment where protocol ended and survival began, and that decision would change everything. The monitors at bed 7 screamed at 0300. Katie's eyes opened before her brain registered the sound. 18 years of field medicine made that transition instant, sleep to alert in the space between heartbeats. The child's heart rate spiked across the screen, 180. 185, 191. His small body went rigid, spine arching off the mattress, fingers curling inward as the seizure took hold. She was moving before conscious thought caught up. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their electric hum as she crossed the pediatric unit. Nobody else stirred. Night shift at Oak Creek Memorial ran skeleton crew, 2 nurses covering 12 beds, 1 resident sleeping in the call room, and Sterling 3 miles away in his Buckhead mansion, unreachable by design. Katie's hands moved on their own. Senior Chief muscle memory. The kind of reflexive precision that came from 7 years of keeping Marines alive in a combat zone where waiting for authorization meant burying bodies. She pulled the crash cart close, scanning the monitors with a clinical detachment that separated good nurses from the ones who froze. Vital signs cascading. Oxygen saturation dropping from 94 to 89. Blood pressure climbing toward dangerous territory, the body compensating, fighting something it couldn't overcome. The seizure was the symptom, not the disease. Katie had seen this pattern before. In Helmand Province. In forward operating bases under IDF. In the faces of 18-year-old Marines whose chests wouldn't rise. Pericardial effusion. The fluid sac around the child's heart was filling. The pressure building. His small heart couldn't pump against the weight of it. The monitors were screaming because his body was dying in increments. She pulled a spinal needle from the crash cart, 18-gauge, sterile, ready. The kind of tool that lived in field medical kits. The kind that saved lives when there was no time for cardiologists or imaging studies or the bureaucratic luxury of waiting for authorization. Her fingers found the landmarks on his thin ribs. 5th intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same in children, the margins were just smaller. Katie prepped the site with chlorhexidine, her movements precise and economical. There was no hesitation in her hands. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the controlled violence of someone who knew exactly what would happen if she moved even half a millimeter off target. Lung tissue. Diaphragm. Anything but the pericardial sac meant a hemorrhage she couldn't stop. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She guided the needle in. The resistance changed. The give of healthy tissue became the resistance of fluid. She knew that sensation like she knew her own heartbeat. She performed this procedure 63 times, first in a medical school simulation lab, then in a field hospital in Farah province where a Marine's collapsed lung was draining into his chest cavity and nobody else was breathing. The child's body convulsed, but the needle was in. She was committed. Katie withdrew the plunger. Red fluid filled the syringe. 10 milliliters. 20. 30. She could see the monitors responding in real time. Heart rate dropping from 191 to 175. The oxygen saturation climbing, 89 to 91 to 94. The pressure relieving. The small heart finally able to beat again without the weight of accumulated blood crushing its chambers. 60 milliliters total. She withdrew the needle, pressure held for 10 seconds, and the child's seizure stopped. The monitors normalized. Heart rate steady at 112, elevated but sinus. Oxygen saturation 97. Blood pressure 98/62. The child's eyes fluttered. His small hands relaxed. The rigid tension drained from his body like a tide going out. Katie disposed of the needle in the sharps container, her breathing steady. Her hands were dry. Her voice, if she'd used it, would have been level. There were no witnesses. No cameras in the pediatric ICU. Just a nurse and a child who'd stopped dying at 0304 hours. She documented the procedure with the clinical precision of someone writing for a court-martial. Time. Vitals. Equipment. Outcome. The words were sparse, factual, and completely accurate. Emergency cardiac tamponade relieved via bedside pericardiocentesis. 60 milliliters sanguineous fluid. Patient stabilized. Sterling arrived at 0621. He walked into the pediatric unit still wearing yesterday's cologne, something expensive and aggressive, like a man who needed his appearance to announce his superiority. His eyes went to bed 7 first. The child sleeping peacefully. The monitors tracking a normal rhythm. The 4 bags still dripping normal saline. For 3 seconds, Sterling's face showed confusion, as though the child's stability was an inconvenience. Then he saw Katie's documentation in the chart. His jaw tightened. Not the tightening of concern. The tightening of someone whose careful architecture had been destabilized. He read the procedure note twice, his eyes moving faster than his comprehension could follow, looking for errors that weren't there. Pericardiocentesis. 0304, patient response, immediate stabilization. He pulled out his phone before Katie finished charting her morning vitals. She watched him walk to the far end of the unit, his voice dropping below the ambient sound of the machines, but his body language saying everything. Angry. Urgent. Familiar. The posture of someone calling allies, not administrators. 20 minutes later, hospital security appeared at the unit entrance. Not the regular evening shift guard she knew from weeks of quiet nods. 2 men in pressed uniforms with the controlled bearing of people trained in institutional power. They didn't point at her. They didn't need to. Sterling had already turned toward her station, his expression arranged in the mask of professional concern that men like him wore when they were about to weaponize policy. By 0745, Katie was in the administrator's office. The space was exactly what she expected: mahogany desk, leather chairs, diplomas on the wall from schools that charge tuition by the semester. The hospital board president, a grey-haired woman named Victoria Chen who'd hired Katie 8 months ago, sat behind that desk with papers spread before her like evidence at a trial. Dr. Sterling occupied the chair beside it, his posture the image of aggrieved authority. Ms. Morrison, Victoria began, and Katie heard the formal distance in how she used the surname. Pending investigation of last night's unauthorized procedure, you are suspended effective immediately. Katie's hands remained flat on the table. The child was coding. Cardiac tamponade. He needed. I've contacted your nursing school, Sterling interrupted, sliding his phone across the desk as though it held evidence. Verifying your clinical training hours. I've also initiated a comprehensive audit of your patient charts. He leaned back in the leather chair with the satisfaction of a man playing his endgame. Several families have expressed concerns about care protocols. The lie was seamless. No families had contacted him. But the accusation was the structure, not the substance. The substance was what came next. Victoria slid a form across the desk. The investigation will determine specifics. For now, we need your badge and access card. Katie's hands clenched. Not from panic. From the weight of institutional machinery recognizing what she was, not a threat, but a witness. Someone who'd seen what Sterling was doing. Someone whose insistence on continuity of care meant tracking patterns that he needed obscured. She placed the badge on the desk. The access card. The physical objects that said she belonged here. The security escort arrived before she could speak, a young officer who looked uncomfortable, who'd probably been told to treat this with deference because she was being escorted for administrative review, which was genteel language for expulsion. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum as they walked the corridors. Through the pediatric unit. Past the room where the child slept with his father in a chair beside the bed, James Reeves still in his dress uniform, still not sleeping. The boy's eyes opened as Katie passed. His small lips moved. One word. Whispered. Reaper. Reeves went rigid. His entire body locked, as though someone had fired a round near his position. His eyes snapped toward the child. What did you say, buddy? But the boy had gone silent again, his eyes watching Katie disappear down the corridor behind the security officer who didn't understand what he was watching. Didn't understand that a child who hadn't spoken in 6 months had just broken silence. Didn't understand that the name he'd heard was the call sign of a legend. Katie sat in her apartment for 3 days. The phone didn't ring. Her email remained empty except for the formal notification that her suspension was active and that she shouldn't contact the hospital pending completion of the investigation. She'd saved enough money. 12 years of military salary, followed by 8 months of civilian wages spent carefully. She could survive unemployment. She'd survived worse. She'd survived IEDs and ambushes and the specific horror of watching young men bleed out because the nearest trauma surgeon was 60 kilometers away by helicopter. This was different. This was the slow death. The institutional kind. The kind that didn't leave marks. On the 4th day, she drove to the Houston VA hospital and took a number in the waiting room. The space was filled with the particular gravity of people who'd been broken by the government and were now asking it to fix them. A Marine corporal with a prosthetic leg reading a magazine with the pages half-turned. An Army specialist with burn scars mapping his neck and jaw, staring at nothing. A Navy corpsman who looked 18 but had the eyes of someone who'd been 23 in Kandahar and had never aged back down. Katie took a seat in the plastic chair, her intake form folded on her lap. Around her, the fluorescent lights buzzed their eternal hum. The clock on the wall said 14:47. The waiting room smelled like industrial cleaners and old coffee and the specific rust metal scent of institutionalism. The young corpsman glanced at her. His eyes started to move away, then something made them snap back. Recognition. The angle of her jaw. The way she sat, the postural control of someone trained to disclose nothing through her body. His expression began to shift. The smile starting. The kind of smile that came when you recognized someone who'd made sure you went home alive. Katie shook her head. Just once. Just enough. Her eyes locked with his. Not pleading. Senior Chief didn't plead. She was simply communicating the only order that mattered: stand down. Let it go. Don't say the name. Don't acknowledge what you're seeing. The corpsman's smile died. Confusion replaced it. He looked away, deeply uncertain, the way civilians look when they realize the rules of engagement have changed and they don't understand the signal. Katie sat in a plastic chair and clutched the intake form and became invisible again. The waiting room waited. The clock ticked. Around her, veterans sought help for demons that looked exactly like the ones that had driven her into hiding. The irony was so precise it could cut glass. She'd spent 18 years keeping these men alive so they could come here and heal. She'd spent 8 months pretending to be someone else to keep helping people. Now she was sitting in a waiting room surrounded by the evidence of everything she'd sacrificed. And nobody knew her face. The administrator's office on the 4th floor of Oak Creek Memorial smelled like expensive coffee and leather furniture that cost more than Katie's annual salary. She sat in a chair that faced 3 people arranged like a court. Dr. Sterling, the hospital board president, whose name was Hayes and whose hand rested on a manila folder the color of institutional failure. And a woman Katie didn't recognize, the hospital's legal counsel, her posture suggesting she'd been called in to witness something. Hayes opened the folder. Ms. Morrison, this is an incident report filed by Dr. Sterling regarding an unauthorized medical procedure performed at 0307 on patient John Reeves, age 7. His voice carried the measured tone of someone reading from a script he'd read before. Emergency pericardiocentesis. Without physician authorization. Without proper credentialing documentation. Katie's hands remained still in her lap. Not clenched. Not trembling. Just resting where her wrists showed the thin white lines of old scars, barely visible beneath her scrub sleeves. Sterling leaned forward, his face flushed with something that looked like vindication. She violated every protocol. Exceeded her scope. Endangered a pediatric patient based on her own judgment. He paused, letting the words settle. A judgment that was, frankly, reckless. The legal counsel cleared her throat. Your employment contract specifies that all interventions beyond standard nursing protocols require physician authorization. The boy was on monitor. A cardiologist was on call. There were procedures available that didn't require. He was dying, Katie said. Not loud. Not angry. Just fact. 7 words. That was all. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hayes shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Regardless of the outcome, the process was violated. Dr. Sterling has requested that we open a formal investigation. He slid a second document across the desk. As of 0700 this morning, you're suspended pending the credentialing review. Katie read the suspension notice. 30 days. Loss of credentials. The kind of suspension that echoed through databases and followed nurses from hospital to hospital like a branded scar. Sterling stood, and his voice dropped into something colder, more calculated. I've also filed a report with the Board of Nursing. They'll want to review your clinical judgment and decision-making processes. He glanced at Hayes. And I recommended we contact her previous employers. Check her history. People with a pattern of insubordination tend to. That's all, Dr. Sterling, Hayes said quietly, but his eyes had gone distant. He knew. Katie could see it in the shift of his shoulders. He knew this was less about the procedure and more about something else. But he also knew that administrators protected administrators, and doctors protected doctors, and the woman in the scrubs who saved a child's life without permission had broken the sacred rule. She'd acted without asking. The legal counsel stood. We'll need your badge, Ms. Morrison. And you'll need to vacate your locker by end of business today. A supervisor will escort you through the process. Katie removed her badge from around her neck. Oak Creek Memorial, employee ID 847293, her photograph from 6 months ago when she thought hiding meant safety. She set it on the desk. The laminate caught the light. By 0745, she was walking down the corridor with Marcus from HR, a man in his 50s who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. They didn't speak. Her locker was in the staff break room on the pediatric unit, the one where 3 nurses had left the moment she sat down 2 days ago. Now those same nurses watched from a distance as Marcus opened the lock and Katie removed her things. A sweater. A thermos. A photograph of a sunrise over water that she'd taken 12 years ago on leave in San Diego. And the boots. The worn size 7 combat boots she kept on the bottom shelf, the leather cracked from desert heat, the laces still tied in the double knot she'd learned as a teenager at basic training. She pulled them out, and for a moment, her hands weren't entirely steady. The leather was warm in her grip, as if it remembered something her body was trying to forget. Just those items? Marcus asked, not meeting her eyes. Just these, Katie said, and she closed her fingers around the boots like they were the only real thing in the room. The badge photograph for the incident report happened at 0843. A camera flash in the HR office. Her face, tired and unremarkable, documented as evidence of violation. They printed it. They filed it. They sealed it inside a record that would follow her. 3 days later, Katie sat in a waiting room at the Houston VA hospital, an intake form trembling slightly in her hands. Not because she was afraid. Because the last time she'd been in a building with this kind of institutional green and tan walls and the smell of antiseptic mixed with desperation, she'd been the one holding the instruments. The waiting room was full of ghosts wearing unit shirts. A Marine in 2/5 colors reading a magazine upside down. An army medic with a chest full of ribbons, one-eyed tracking movement like he was still in Kandahar. A Navy corpsman with tattoos on his hands that spelled out call signs of people who weren't coming home. They all wore the uniform of men and women who'd seen the exact worst and were now sitting in uncomfortable chairs waiting to tell strangers about it. Katie kept her eyes down. She was here because 3 days of sitting in her apartment had shown her that silence wasn't healing, it was just slow drowning with the lights on. The VA was her last option. The only place where nobody would ask her name and expect a civilian answer. A young Marine corpsman, maybe 24, walked past with his own intake form. He glanced at her face casually, the way people do in waiting rooms. His eyes went soft. Recognition flickered. Not just acknowledgement, memory. The kind of memory that comes from having someone save your life, even if you only saw them in the dark with fire all around. He started to smile. His hand came up in a small wave, the gesture of someone greeting a ghost he thought was dead. Katie's head moved in one sharp motion. No. Her eyes locked on his for exactly 1 second, long enough to communicate the full weight of the request, and then she looked away. Down at the intake form. At the boxes asking about suicidal ideation and substance abuse and the number of nights she'd stayed awake hearing things that no longer existed. The corpsman's hand dropped. He walked past without speaking. But in that moment, Katie understood something that had been building for 6 months. The hiding wasn't working. The silence wasn't protection. She'd traded everything to disappear, and now she was sitting in a VA hospital surrounded by people she'd bled with, and she was begging them not to see her. That was rock bottom. Not the suspension notice. Not the humiliation. Not even the fear that Sterling would end her license. It was this, the choice between being seen and being saved. And the terrifying understanding that maybe they were the same thing. The intake form asked for her name. She wrote it slowly. Catherine Ann Morrison. 34 years old. Former Navy Hospital Corpsman, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Reason for visit, psychological evaluation and trauma assessment. The checkbox for post-traumatic stress disorder was already marked by someone earlier in the process, as if they'd known before she even walked in. She set the form on the window and waited. Around her, the waiting room held its breath. The Marine in the 2/5 shirt glanced up once, his eyes uncertain, as if he almost recognized her voice. But she didn't speak. She just sat with her boots at her feet and her intake form in her lap and her name finally written down for someone to read. Day 4 of Katie's suspension, and the boy's eyes open like someone lighting a match in a dark room. His father leans close, so close their foreheads almost touch, and watches his son's chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of a child finally, truly breathing. The ventilator hisses its mechanical pulse. Lieutenant Commander James Reeves has not slept in 72 hours. His uniform is wrinkled. His jaw carries 2 days of stubble that looks like charcoal dust on granite. He whispers something Katie will never hear, a father's prayer, maybe, or a promise, and the boy's lips move. They tremble. They form a single word so faint that Reeves has to lower his ear to the child's mouth to catch it. Reaper. The word hangs in the ICU like a name being called across empty terrain. Reeves goes absolutely still. His hand moves to his son's forehead, steadies there, and something in his face shifts, recognition, or memory, or the moment when a past you buried suddenly surfaces and pulls you under. He doesn't move for 40 seconds. The monitor beeps. The ventilator sighs. Outside the window, Houston's midday heat shimmers off the parking lot like spilled gasoline. Reeves stands. He moves with the precise deliberation of a man operating on muscle memory alone, down the corridor, past the nurse's station where Jennifer and Marcus pretend not to notice him, down to the staff lockers where Katie's name is still printed on a faded label. His fingers work the combination lock from memory, because he recognizes it, recognizes the small dent in the metal, recognizes something about the way it sits among all the other identical lockers like a marker for something sacred. The door swings open. Combat boots. Size 7. Worn leather the color of old blood and desert sand, laces threaded with the precision of someone who learned to tie them in the dark. The call sign stitched inside the left boot is embroidered in white thread that's been reinforced a dozen times, Reaper in capital letters, and below it, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, 2011 to 2014. He doesn't move. His hands, which have held weapons and wounded soldiers and his own terrified child, begin to shake with the kind of tremor that comes not from weakness but from the sudden collision of two worlds. The boots smell like diesel fuel and old rain. He pulls them out. His eyes close. Then he moves to the personnel files. His security clearance is still active, they never formally revoked it, stupid mistake on administration's part. He finds Katie's employment record, and his hands move across the pages with the methodical precision of someone reading coordinates on a map. Nursing license issued 2015. Prior military service verified. Background check, passed. Previous employer, Helmand Province Forward Operating Base, Medical Support Specialist. Rank listed as Senior Chief Petty Officer. Separation date, 2014. Discharge status, medical, PTSD, approved for transition. Specialist certifications, combat medicine, practical nursing, emergency procedures, field surgery. He cross-references the dates against the deployment records he carries in his head like shrapnel. 2011 to 2014. Helmand. Charlie Platoon. That's 3 tours. That's 72 straight hours of triage under fire at the Sanjin Valley Medical Station. That's the medic who ran into a burning convoy to pull out 2 Marines while rounds were still hitting the vehicle. That's the voice he heard over the radio saying Angel 6, we've got for priority ones coming in at 0300 in the morning while mortars were landing 200 meters out. That's hands that had held his own abdomen while IED shrapnel was burning through his tactical vest. That's the warrior who carried him 2 kilometers through hostile territory with his organs held together by bandages and pure will. That's Reaper. That's Katie Morrison. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it brought the hospital to its knees. Reeves walks into the administrator's office at 0830 with the combat boots under his arm like a declaration. Behind him comes Master Chief Petty Officer Michael Halloway, SEAL Team 3, still on active roster, still wearing the uniform like it was sewn into his skin. The administrator, a woman named Dr. Chen who spent the last 60 hours trying to contain the fallout from Dr. Sterling's behavior, looks up from her keyboard and sees the boots. She sees Reeves' face. She understands immediately that everything is about to change. Sir, madam, Reeves says, and his voice drops to the register it only achieves when he's giving orders that will cost lives if they're not followed exactly. I need you to understand something about the nurse you suspended. Her name is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. And you just terminated her employment for saving my son's life. Master Chief Halloway steps forward. His shoulders are wide as a doorframe. His voice is the color of sand and gravel. 3 bronze stars. He places a folder on the desk. 2 purple hearts. Another page. Navy Commendation Medal with Valor. 1 more. And a Navy Cross for actions under fire in the Sanjin Valley, 2012. The final page. This is what you fired, Dr. Chen. This is who you just escorted from the building like she was a liability. Dr. Chen's face goes pale. Her hand moves to the phone. I need to. Already done, comes a voice from the doorway. Rodriguez, the IT specialist, former Army signals analyst, 2 tours in Baghdad, still wears a U.S. Army Ranger's ring on his right hand, enters carrying a laptop the way some people carry infants. His face is the color of someone who's been awake for 36 hours because he has. Dr. Sterling accessed your encrypted patient insurance database 17 times between midnight and 0600 this morning. Each time he tried to delete files. I've archived everything. Rodriguez opens the laptop. The files cascade across the screen like an accounting of someone's moral bankruptcy. Sterling accessing Katie's performance reviews at 0145. Sterling altering her patient outcome data at 0312. Sterling meeting with another man, later identified as Dr. Brookman, Sterling's brother-in-law, in the parking lot at 0447, exchanging an envelope that Rodriguez's camera had captured with telephoto clarity. Sterling then accessing psychiatric billing records and inflating diagnostic codes, changing consultation recommended to consultation completed and billed, creating false claims totaling $47,000 over 18 months. The offshore account transfer came from Sterling Consulting Holdings, Rodriguez says, and his voice is quiet, which makes it worse. Wire transfers to an account registered to James Sterling, MD. You're Dr. Sterling. Every other Friday. 22 transfers. $484,000. The fluorescent lights hum above them, that sound that drives people crazy in hospitals, that steady white noise that's the soundtrack to every bad decision ever made in an office like this one. Then the FBI agent enters. Special Agent Victoria Chen, no relation to the administrator, holds credentials and a case file that's thicker than most people's medical records. Dr. Marcus Sterling, I'm Special Agent Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We've been tracking insurance fraud tied to your referral patterns for 8 months. Your brother-in-law's psychiatric practice has been generating false claims in your name. She places the folder on the desk. It lands with the weight of evidence that doesn't forgive. 18 coordinated billing cycles. Kickback payments deposited to an account in the Cayman Islands. All of it traceable. Sterling enters at that moment. He'd been waiting in the adjacent conference room, summoned by the administrator, walking into a room where his entire life is already on the table in careful stacks of paper and digital evidence. His face goes the color of old milk. His mouth opens. Nothing comes out. I want my attorney, he whispers. That's advisable, Agent Chen says. She pulls out a second folder. Federal charges. Wire fraud, insurance fraud, obstruction of justice, falsification of medical records. We'll be obtaining warrants for your personal and business accounts. She glances at Rodriguez. Thank you for the additional evidence. That move where you tried to delete the security footage at 0600, that's enough for an obstruction count on its own. Sterling reaches for his tablet. Rodriguez moves faster, a man with reflexes that came from disarming IEDs in Fallujah. His hand closes over the device first. Already uploaded, document federal servers. Encrypted. You could blow yourself up and it wouldn't matter. Sterling's hands start shaking. His face is the color of surrender. Dr. Chen, the administrator, looks at Lieutenant Commander Reeves with something like awe on her face. I am profoundly sorry, Commander. Senior Chief Morrison. We need her back. Not just back, we need to rebuild what we broke. Reeves doesn't speak. He just holds out the combat boots, worn leather and white stitching and a call sign that means something to the people who understand what it costs to earn it. She earned those in a war zone. And you tried to erase her because a coward wanted to hide his theft. He places them on the desk. She saved my son's life. That wasn't protocol violation. That was heroism. And before you offer her a raise or a medal or your apologies, you should understand what you were really dealing with the entire time. The room is so quiet you can hear the rain that started outside, hammering the hospital roof like applause. Outside the window, Houston stretches in all directions, a city of millions, and inside one small office, a woman is about to be reborn. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were, you understand what's about to happen next. Katie Morrison is about to walk back into Oak Creek Memorial not as a suspended nurse, but as a hero. And sometimes the bravest thing we do is stop hiding. If this story resonated with you, if you know what it means to be invisible until someone finally sees you, please like, subscribe, and comment below. What would you have done in Katie's position? Would you have saved that child, knowing it would cost you everything? Let me know. And come back, because her story isn't over.